Hey, there's Pastor Doug, and I'm here to tell you a story. I hope that you've been enjoying these Jack Tales and learning the lessons that go along with them. This is a story that happened at a time whenever Jack and Will and Tom and his mom was all living out in that cabin that they had worked on and had continued to live at and was really enjoying themselves pretty good. And while they were doing well, why, the king was not. They'd heard that the king had gotten so sick that he had to just lay in bed. Why, he couldn't get up to hardly do anything. They had to just take care of him right where he was. And things was going okay for a while, but he got to be pretty bored. He just had thought all the things he could think of. He couldn't get up and do nothing, and he was just hoping that somebody would do something to help him. And then he thought, maybe I might not ever get better. And if I don't ever get better, then my little old girl won't have anyone to get married to. And while some people, the poor folks, just fell in love with each other and got married, the rich folk, they didn't do it that way. No, the kings always picked out a fella for their daughters, trying to make sure it was the right one. And so he got together his council, and they started telling him, well, we ought to pick out the strongest person. And the king said, well, what if the strongest person wasn't the brightest person? Oh, then you ought to get the brightest person. Well, what if the brightest person isn't the one who's the most compassionate person? And the men just kept talking to him and sharing things, and the king started thinking to himself, why, he was enjoying so much having these fellas talk to him and share their stories with him that's exactly what he was going to do. He was going to pick out who might get to marry his daughter by who could come in and tell him a story. And they told him, said, well, if you're going to have a contest, there ought to be a way to win it. And the king got to thinking. He says, well, I think that whoever can tell me a story I just can't believe, why, that would be the very one that would be the most intelligent and brightest and creative person there is. And why, that's the very one I want to be the next king. And so all the news went out, and everybody started coming in and telling the king a story. Why, he heard all kinds of things. He heard about giants, and he heard about witches, and he heard about lands far away and lands near. He heard about little things that were taking place around their country and things that were great, big, and huge. And why, he had heard so much that he just was captivated, and he loved it. But the king had one of them minds where anytime someone was telling him a story, he could just close his eyes and picture it to be true. And it didn't matter what he said, he could just imagine that it really was. In fact, after a while, everybody got to believing that nobody could tell him a story that he just couldn't believe to be true. And that went for Tom and for Will as themselves. They'd all gone down there and they'd tried. And why, everybody except for Jack had tried. And Jack said, well, I'm not really interested in going down and telling him a story to start with because, well, I'm still a little old boy. I'm not too interested in getting married to the king's daughter and becoming the next king. Well, I got my whole life in front of me, and I still haven't even begun to seek my fortune. And so why would I want to get all tangled up with something like that? But Will and Tom finally convinced him. They said, now, if you're going to go to the king's house, you got to get all dressed up. Now, their daddy had some old clothes left behind, and they took those clothes and they measured him up for him, and they cut them, and they built him a nice little bit of a uniform to go on. And they thought if he's going to look so nice like that, they ought to give him something. And he put a old rope around his waist, and they gave him an old mowing scythe for a sword, and it hung down nearly to the ground. And why, they put a hat and pulled it down nearly to his eyes, and they just marveled at him and says, oh, Jack, why, you look like an amazing person now. Why, you look like you could have come from a far country with great stories to tell. You don't look like you come around here at all. Now, of course, they wasn't telling Jack the truth, because he just looked like himself with a bunch of stuff on him that didn't quite fit and didn't quite look. But Jack got to imagine it to be true, and he just held himself up straight, and he marched himself all the way to the king's house. Now, by that time, there wasn't hardly any fellas coming around, so he got right in entrance. And whenever Jack come in and he was ready to have himself introduced, the king just looked up from his bed and saw Jack and says, "Oh, Law, Jack, what are you here for?" He says, "Why, I'm here to tell you a story that you just can't believe." He says, "Oh, Jack, I know where you come from. I know your mama, your brothers Will and Tom done been in here. Know your daddy, he sure was a good man. And I tell you, Jack, I don't imagine that you could tell me anything." And so Jack says, "Oh, you can't believe that I can't tell you a story that you can't believe?" And the king thought about it and said, "No, I bet you might be able to do that too." He wasn't about to let himself get caught in such an easy trap. And so Jack started going, "Well, he's just trying to think of something to say. He hadn't had a story in mind. And says, "Well, you know how my daddy's been gone. My brother's been working. I've just been around the house, and I'm the one who's been planting all the fields by myself and getting all the corn by myself and bringing it all in. And so I'm the one who's doing all the work. My brothers, Will and Tom, and even though my mama's a good mom, they're taking care of all the little stuff, but I'm the one who's doing all the work." And the king said, "Oh, I can see it, Jack. I can just close my eyes and see it. I can see you out there just a-working away, a-planting in the spring and making sure it gets watered and a-weeding and everything. And I can just imagine that you're the one to do it. Now tell me, did you have to harvest all that yourself?" He says, "Oh, let me tell you how that happened, King. I was out in my field, and I had my little pocket knife with me, and I was whittling on a stick that I might use to find me some water, and I was going along, and I seen a rabbit. And when I saw that rabbit, I took aim with my knife, and I throwed it at that rabbit, thinking that might be a pretty good dinner." And the king says, "Oh, I can just see you throwing your knife right at that rabbit. Did you kill it, Jack? Did you kill it?" He goes, "Oh, no. Why, whenever that knife came running at that rabbit just turned its head and bit its mouth open and caught my knife right in its mouth. Why, it was sticking out to the side with the blade coming out, and I started to chasing that rabbit because I wanted to get my knife right. And as he took off running, that knife started cutting down all of the different corn stalks. It was running this way and back up that way, and by the time I got up close to it, he'd cut down the whole field for me. And that's when I got to harvesting everything together, and that's how I got all that in." And the king says, "Oh, I can just see it, Jack. I can just see it. There you are, just harvesting that whole field up there, not quite by yourself. You had that rabbit to help you." Jack says, "Oh, I guess so, but it finally let go of my knife, and I got it back in my pocket where it belongs." And Jack said, "Oh, this king, he just believe anything." He says, "Well, you remember that time not too long ago when we had that terrible famine around here and nobody could grow any corn at all?" And the king says, "Oh, that was a terrible time. I didn't think we was going to survive. We had to go on our reserves, and there was no rain, and that was an awful, terrible time." And Jack says, "Well, I'm sure you remember that I was the very one who went over the ocean and brought back all that corn that helped us get by until the next harvest come in." And the king said, I don't remember that. You're going to have to remind me, Jack." And Jack says, "Oh, don't you remember? Why, I just got up here by your house, and I started running down toward the ocean, and I got going faster and faster and faster and faster. And by the time I got down there to the beach, I just hit my foot on a big rock, so it was a nice solid launch spot, and I launched myself in the air, and I went fairly flying right through the ocean currents, right to the other side, and I come landing down in jolly old England. Why, I came down with such a hard thud that the king's men come out to inspect what it was, and they just found me standing there." And the king was going, "I can just see it, Jack. I can just see it. There you are flying over the ocean. What did the king say? What did the king say over there? He says, oh, he brought me in. He heard how bad off it was around here, and he said I could have 500 bushels of corn if I had any way to get it back. And I started to thinking to myself that I had forgotten to bring me a sack to put it in. And so I felt a scratch on my neck, and then I realized it wasn't a scratch, it was an itch. And when I realized it was an itch, it was a little bitty old flea that had got onto me, and I picked it off. And I pulled out my trusty pocket knife, and I got rid of that old flea, and I skinned it right there in front of the king, and I turned its hide inside out, and I made myself a flea skin bag. And that king was saying, oh, I can just see it, Jack. I can just see it. There you are with your flea skin bag. But the flea skin bag's not very big. How'd you get that corn in there? He says, oh, that was the hard part. Why, the hardest part was getting that first kernel of corn down in there. And it just stretched a little bit. And then I got another kernel in. And pretty soon I had half a cob in. And then pretty soon I got a whole cob of corn in. And then I got one cob after another. And that flea skin bag just started stretching bigger and bigger and bigger. And the king says, oh, I can just see it. I can just see it. There's that bag getting bigger and all that corn just going in. He says, oh, I got it all in. I got all 500 bushels there right in my flea skin bag. But I realized it was going to slow me down a bit. I didn't dare try to jump back over the ocean with all that extra weight. I might not make it, and then everybody would go starving anyways. And I wasn't sure what to do when I noticed there was this great big old dark cloud coming my way. And as it got closer and the shadows started coming over us, I realized that it was a great big flock of black ducks. Now, them ducks come a-flying right down there, landed in the field that I just harvested up and got all those 500 bushels from. And they laid down there, and it looked like a great big old black carpet. I just rolled my bag on top of the backs of all them ducks, and those ducks started a-flapping and flying together, and they just rose up in one single mass, and they lifted me up. It's a good thing that they was headed back this way. They just flew with one accord, and there we were, me and my flea skin bag on the back of all them ducks a-flying together, and we just come right over the ocean. And the king said, oh, I can just close my eyes. I can just see you flying over the ocean. Well, how'd you know where to land? Were you able to see? He goes, well, that was part of the tricky matter. When we was getting closer again, there were so many ducks around, I couldn't see out over the edge to know exactly where we were. And we got pretty close where I thought we was nearby, and I got to looking down there, and whenever I pulled a couple of wings apart to look through, why, I slipped right down through the ducks. And my bag started coming down right after me. The king says, oh, I can just see it, Jack. I can just see it. There you are, flying and falling right down out of the air. He says, oh, that's not the worst of it, king, not the worst at all. Why, fortunately, that bag started moving off with some of the wind current, so it didn't just fall right down on top of me. But I started falling down so hard and so fast that I landed right down on a great big old rock, and I just sunk in that rock right up to my neck. And the king said, oh, I can just see it. I can just see it. There you are, sinking down in that rock right up to your neck. And he says, wow, when that stone was all around me, I couldn't move. I was in a terrible fix. All I thought to myself was, if my mama was around, why, she was the one who could come and help get me out. Because my mama can get me out of any kind of trouble, any kind of hard place. And I was in a terrible hard place. And so my mama, if I could just get to her, get a message to her, I just didn't know what to do to get my body up out of there. And that's when I looked over and I noticed my sword here had fallen out and was laying right next to me, but there was no way for me to reach it. My arms were all in that rock. And that king was saying, oh, I can just see it, Jack. I can just see it. Why, you're in a terrible fix. What'd you do? He says, well, I just reached out with my chin and I grabbed my knife, my sword, and I just brought it over and I started cutting my neck off. And the king says, oh, I can just see it, Jack, just cutting it off. Says, I cut my head right off, and it rolled over a little bit. And I told my head, you need to head for home. And my head just started rolling down the road. And things was going along pretty good. I figured I'd get up to my mama's house pretty quick, and she could come and get the rest of me out. And the king says, I can just see it. I can just see it. There's your head, just rolling along. He says, it was going pretty good until I went by a little thorn bush place, and there was a little old fox in there that seen me rolling by, and it jumped out, and it started running and following me. And I tried to tell my head to run faster and faster and roll faster, and I just couldn't get away from that old fox. That fox was getting closer, and I was getting scared that I wouldn't get to my mama in time. And so I was going as fast as I could, and that old fox was getting faster and faster. Pretty soon I could just smell and feel its breath right on my neck as I was rolling away and trying to get home. And once I got faster and faster, I knew it was no use to going anymore. That fox was going to catch me. And so I knew I only had one thing left to do. The king was, what's that, Jack? What's that? What you do? He says, I stopped. And I turned my head around, and I looked right up at that fox, and I said, Fox, if you come one step closer, I'm going to stomp you to death. And that fox got scared to death, and it just started to turn and run away. And the king says, why, Jack, you couldn't have stomped on that fox. Why, you didn't even have no legs. Why, that was the stupidest fox there ever was. And now Jack just leaned back and says, oh, that fox not the stupidest thing there ever was. It wasn't half as stupid as you, king. And the king just got all mad and upset. And he says, why, I'm not half as stupid as an old fox. And that's how he said, I just don't believe it. And that's when Jack said, I told you a story you just can't believe. Because the king just couldn't believe that anybody would tell him that he's half as stupid as a little old fox that was afraid of getting stomped to death with someone who didn't have no legs. And that's the story of how Jack got to be engaged to the king's daughter because he told him a story that he just couldn't believe. Now, I tell you that story because the Bible is full of stories that some people just can't believe are true. Why, they read about Jesus giving sight to the blind or raising up the dead or just healing someone who's got a crippled hand. And they said those things are just fairy tales. They just can't be true. And they can't be true if it's just left up to a person like you and me. But God did things that only God can do because our God specializes in the impossible. And Jesus did the impossible to show that he was God. That he wasn't just man, but that he was fully God. And he could do only the things that God can do. That's why he's called the Son of God. And because of that, he wanted to say, well, what's more impossible? For me to give sight to the blind, or to me to help the deaf hear, or me to help someone who's lame to walk again? Or would it be more impossible for me to forgive you your sins? And Jesus wanted us to know that he could do what only God can do. And we need that. We need a God who can forgive us our sins. And so we have a God who does the impossible. And that's why I told you that story.